What happens when Hollywood's most beloved comeback story meets late-night television's most notorious antagonist? You won't believe what unfolds when Robert Downey Jr. sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. The tension that's been brewing behind the scenes for years finally erupts into a full-scale battle that leaves audiences stunned and questioning everything they thought they knew about celebrity interviews. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in ways nobody saw coming. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live was supposed to be another standard promotional stop for Robert Downey Jr., who was making the rounds to discuss his latest project. The actor, known for his quick wit and media savvy, seemed relaxed as he walked onto the set, flashing his trademark smirk to the enthusiastic studio audience. What nobody anticipated was that this would be the last time viewers would see that confident smile for the remainder of the evening. The trouble began almost immediately during the pre-interview banter, when Kimmel made what many are calling a calculated jab disguised as humor. As Downey settled into the guest chair, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket, Kimmel couldn't resist opening with what he probably thought was clever wordplay about the actor's past struggles with addiction. Well, Robert Downey Jr., looking sharp as always. I have to say, you're looking much more stable than the last time we had you on, Kimmel said with that signature smug grin that his critics know all too well. The studio audience let out an uncomfortable chuckle, but those watching closely could see Downey's expression shift almost imperceptibly. His practiced media smile remained intact, but there was something different in his eyes. A flash of irritation that suggested this wasn't going to be the friendly chat everyone expected. "Always the charmer, Jimmy," Downey replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to signal that he wasn't going to let the comments slide as easily as Kimmel might have hoped. But Kimmel, perhaps emboldened by what he perceived as a successful opening joke, decided to double down rather than pivot to safer ground. "I mean, it's incredible, really, the transformation. From rock bottom to Iron Man, Hollywood loves a good redemption arc, don't they? Though I suppose some people might say playing a narcissistic billionaire wasn't much of a stretch," he continued, his delivery dripping with the kind of false joviality that barely concealed the barb underneath. The tension in the studio became palpable. Audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even the camera operators seemed to sense something was brewing. Downey's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he leaned back in his chair with the kind of calculated calm that anyone who knew him well would recognize as a warning sign. "That's interesting, Jimmy. You know, I was just thinking the same thing about talk show hosts who punch down for cheap laughs. Not much of a stretch there either, is it?" The comeback hit its mark, and Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment before he attempted to regain control of the situation. But instead of gracefully moving on to the promotional content that was supposed to be the focus of the interview, he made a critical error in judgment that would set the stage for what was about to become one of the most talked-about confrontations in late-night television history. "Oh, come on now, Robert. We're all friends here. Besides, I think my audience appreciates honesty. They can handle a little real talk about Hollywood's favorite comeback kid," Kimmel said, his tone becoming increasingly condescending as he gestured toward the crowd as if they were somehow complicit in his approach. That's when something shifted in Downey's demeanor entirely. The practiced charm that had carried him through countless interviews over the years began to crack, revealing glimpses of the fierce intelligence and righteous anger that lay beneath his carefully constructed public persona. "Real talk?" he repeated, his voice taking on a dangerously quiet quality that made everyone in the studio lean forward instinctively. "You want to have some real talk, Jimmy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and even Kimmel seemed to realize he might have pushed too far. But by then it was already too late. The die had been cast, and what happened next would change everything about how people viewed both men, setting in motion a confrontation that would dominate headlines and social media for days to come. The stage was set for an explosive showdown that nobody in that studio, or watching at home, would ever forget. What followed was a masterclass in how quickly a television interview can spiral completely out of control. Kimmel, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in power dynamics but unwilling to back down, attempted to deflect with his trademark sarcasm. "Oh, I love it when actors get all serious on me. This is good television, folks," he said, turning to address the audience with an exaggerated theatrical gesture that only served to highlight how desperately he was trying to regain control of the situation. But Downey wasn't having any of it. The actor's years of media training and his natural charisma had taught him exactly how to command a room, and he was about to demonstrate why he'd become one of Hollywood's most formidable interview subjects. "You know what's good television, Jimmy? Authenticity. Something you might want to try sometime instead of hiding behind this tired routine of yours," he shot back, his voice steady but loaded with barely contained frustration. The studio audience fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind of dead quiet that only happens when people realize they're witnessing something they probably shouldn't be seeing. Production assistants behind the cameras began exchanging worried glances, and you could practically feel the collective intake of breath from everyone present as they realized this wasn't going to be smoothed over with a commercial break. Kimmel's face flushed red, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack under the pressure. "Excuse me, I've been doing this for over 2 decades, Robert. I think I know a thing or two about television," he snapped, his voice rising with indignation. The mask was slipping, revealing glimpses of the ego that many industry insiders had long suspected lurked beneath his everyman persona. 2 decades. Of what, exactly? Downey countered, leaning forward in his chair with predatory focus. Making cheap shots at people who can't fight back? Punching down at celebrities going through difficult times for easy laughs? That's your legacy, Jimmy. That's what you've built your career on, and we both know it. The accusation hit like a sledgehammer, and Kimmel's expression darkened considerably. That's rich, coming from someone who spent half a decade making headlines for all the wrong reasons. At least I never had to rebuild my entire reputation. From scratch, he fired back, his voice dripping with venom as he abandoned any pretense of professional courtesy. It was the point of no return, the moment when whatever thin veneer of civility had been maintaining the interview completely evaporated. Downey's eyes flashed with genuine anger, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the studio lean forward instinctively. "There it is. The real Jimmy Kimmel, everybody. This is who he really is when the cameras are rolling and he thinks he's got someone cornered." The actor stood up slowly, his movement measured and deliberate, creating a moment of such dramatic tension that you could have heard a pin drop in the studio. "You want to talk about rebuilding reputations? At least I had the courage to acknowledge my mistakes and do the work to become a better person. What's your excuse for still being the same petty, small-minded bully you were when you started?" Kimmel shot to his feet as well, his professional composure completely shattered now. "Bully? I'm a bully? You're the one sitting here attacking me on my own show," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. The transformation was stunning. In just a few minutes, he'd gone from smug talk show host to defensive, cornered. "Animal? I'm responding to your attacks, Jimmy. There's a difference, though I suppose nuance isn't really your strong suit," Downey replied with devastating calm. "You started this the moment I sat down with your little addiction jokes and your condescending attitude. Did you really think I was just going to sit here and take it with a smile?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing and facing off across the interview space like prize fighters in a ring. The studio audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply watch in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's biggest stars systematically dismantled one of late-night television's most established hosts. But this was only the beginning. of what would become an all-out war of words that would leave both men's reputations in tatters and create a viral moment that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. The tension in the studio had become so thick, it was almost suffocating. Camera operators scrambled to capture every angle of the confrontation, realizing they were documenting what would undoubtedly become one of the most infamous moments in late-night television history. The audience sat in stunned silence, caught between fascination and horror as they watched two entertainment industry titans tear each other apart in real time. Kimmel, his face now completely flushed and his composure shattered, made the fatal mistake of trying to regain control through intimidation. "You know what, Robert? I think we're done here. This is my show, and I don't have to sit here and listen to some washed-up actor lecture me about professionalism," he declared, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage as he gestured dismissively toward his guest. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for any remaining civility between them. Downey's expression shifted into something that those who knew him well would recognize as absolutely deadly calm. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention from every single person in that studio. "Washed up?" he repeated slowly, savoring each syllable like he was tasting poison. "That's fascinating coming from someone whose career peaked with asking celebrities to read mean tweets." The audience let out an audible gasp at the brutal comeback. Even the production crew, who had seen countless celebrity meltdowns over the years, seemed shocked by the viciousness of the exchange. But Downey wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He had years of pent-up frustration with the entertainment industry's culture of manufactured controversy, and Kimmel had just given him the perfect target. "You want to talk about being washed up, Jimmy? Let's talk about ratings. Let's talk about relevance. When was the last time anyone under 30 watched your show without it being part of a viral clip? You're a relic clinging to a format that died with Carson, desperately trying to stay relevant by picking fights with people who actually create things people care about," Downey continued, his words landing like precision strikes against Kimmel's already bruised ego. Kimmel's response was pure desperation disguised as bravado. "At least I don't have to rely on a superhero costume to get people to pay attention to me anymore. Face it, Robert, without Marvel, you're just another middle-aged actor trying to recapture past glory," he snarled, crossing a line that everyone in the studio immediately recognized as unforgivable. The comeback was so personal, so calculated to wound, that even hardened industry professionals in the audience shifted uncomfortably. But if Kimmel thought he'd landed a devastating blow, he was about to learn just how badly he'd miscalculated his opponent's capacity for retaliation. Downey smiled then, not his famous charming grin, but something cold and predatory that sent chills through everyone watching. "Marvel didn't make me, Jimmy. I made Marvel. I took a character nobody cared about and turned him into a cultural phenomenon that generated billions of dollars and launched the biggest franchise in entertainment history. What have you created? What's your lasting contribution to anything beyond cheap laughs at other people's expense?" The systematic destruction of Kimmel's professional credibility was breathtaking to witness. With surgical precision, Downey was dismantling not just the man, but everything he'd built his career on. The studio audience was now completely riveted, watching what amounted to a masterclass in how to verbally eviscerate someone on live television. You sit behind that desk every night, making jokes about people who are actually out there creating art, building businesses, changing the world. And what do? You mock them. You diminish them. You turn their struggles into punchlines for your audience to laugh at. That's not entertainment, Jimmy. That's just cruelty dressed up as comedy. Kimmel's face had gone from red to an alarming shade of purple as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. But the damage was done, and everyone in that studio knew it. The host, who had built his reputation on being quick-witted and unflappable, was being systematically destroyed by an actor who had clearly had enough of the entertainment industry's culture of manufactured humiliation. "You know what the really pathetic part is?" Downey continued, his voice now carrying the kind of quiet contempt that cut deeper than any shouting could have. "You actually think this makes you look good. You think tearing people down elevates you somehow. But all it does is reveal how small you really are, how desperately insecure you are about your own lack of substance." The final blow was delivered with such devastating accuracy that you could practically see Kimmel deflate in real time. Whatever response he might have been, preparing died in his throat as the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He had picked a fight with the wrong person, at the wrong time, and now he was paying the price in front of millions of viewers. But Downey still wasn't finished, and what he said next would become the moment that defined the entire confrontation and set up his dramatic exit that no one would ever forget. The actor took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence commanding every ounce of attention in the studio. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had genuinely reached his breaking point with an industry culture he'd tolerated for far too long. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight to talk about my work, to connect with people who might appreciate what we've created. Instead, I walked into an ambush designed to humiliate me for your entertainment." The raw honesty in his voice was startling. Gone was the polished movie star persona, replaced by something far more authentic and infinitely more powerful. "This isn't comedy. This isn't entertainment. This is just a sad man desperately trying to feel important by tearing down people who've actually accomplished something meaningful with their lives." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Downey cut him off with a gesture that was both dismissive and final. "No, Jimmy, you've said enough. We've all heard enough. Your audience deserves better than this, and frankly, so do I." The certainty in his voice was absolute, leaving no room for argument or negotiation. What happened next sent shockwaves through the studio and would become the defining image of the entire confrontation. Downey reached down and began removing his lapel microphone with deliberate, methodical precision. The simple act carried such symbolic weight that several audience members audibly gasped, immediately understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. "This is what integrity looks like, folks," Downey announced to the stunned audience, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent studio, even without amplification. "Sometimes you have to walk away from situations that compromise your values, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." The microphone dropped to the floor with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through the cavernous studio space. The sound was immediately followed by an eerie silence that felt almost sacred in its completeness. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire room held its collective breath as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The man who had built his career on never being at a loss for words found himself completely speechless, watching helplessly as one of Hollywood's biggest stars systematically destroyed not just his show, but his entire professional credibility in front of millions of viewers. But Downey wasn't finished making his point. He turned to address the studio audience directly, his voice carrying the kind of natural authority that reminded everyone why he'd become one of the most compelling performers of his generation. "You deserve hosts who lift people up, who celebrate human achievement, who bring out the best in their guests instead of exploiting their vulnerabilities for cheap laughs." The condemnation was delivered with such quiet dignity that it hit harder than any screaming match could have. Several audience members began nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting a growing understanding of what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a celebrity meltdown. This was a moment of moral clarity that cut through years of normalized cruelty disguised as entertainment. "I've spent years rebuilding my life and my career by treating people with respect and focusing on work that matters," Downey continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the audience. "I won't compromise those values for anyone's amusement. Including yours, Jimmy. The final words were delivered with such devastating finality that they seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the studio. Downey turned his back on Kimmel and began walking toward the stage exit with the kind of purposeful stride that left no doubt about his intentions. As he reached the edge of the stage, he paused for just a moment and looked back over his shoulder. "Good luck with your show, Jimmy. You're going to need it." The words weren't delivered with anger or malice, but with something far more damaging, pity mixed with genuine concern for what Kimmel had become. And with that, Robert Downey Jr. walked off the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, leaving behind a host whose career would never fully recover from the encounter. A studio audience that would never forget what real dignity looked like under pressure, and a viral moment that would reshape conversations about celebrity culture and media responsibility for years to come. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel stood alone on his stage, surrounded by hundreds of people yet looking more isolated than anyone could remember seeing him. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before he finally managed to stammer out a weak, "We'll be right back after this commercial break," his voice barely above a whisper. But the damage was done. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were trending across every social media platform, with overwhelming support for Downey's stance and harsh criticism for Kimmel's behavior. The incident marked a turning point not just for both men's careers, but for an entire industry forced to confront its culture of manufactured humiliation disguised as entertainment. It was the night late-night television changed forever, and everyone who witnessed it knew they'd seen something that would be remembered long after both men were gone.